Okay, welcome to this short video on IGCSE Marine Science section 3.5, and today we will be looking at the 2024 syllabus, and we're going over the algae and protist kingdom, which means macroalgae, microalgae and marine plants. Everything here is non-profit. It's done for my class, but if you can use it for whatever use you want to, you're more than welcome. So there are many species of seagrass, and seagrass are not an algae. They are in fact marine plants. And they have many important functions in the environment, but they are only important in environments where you have clear water because they need sunlight, and you have a good type of sediment for them to settle in. In general, they stabilize the sediment, they bring energy into the food chain, they release oxygen, and they provide shelter, so they're quite a keystone species for the environment where they live. It's important to know that marine plants are in fact plants, which means they are in a family with all the terrestrial plants we see. They have just adapted to life underwater, and we will later compare them to kelp and other kind of seaweeds who are not plants. So seagrass are adapted to living underwater in quite a few ways. They have leaves that point upwards, so you have a large surface area for absorbing sunlight. When you are underwater, of course, there'll be less sunlight than above water. Some will be reflected, some will be refracted. The leaf cells have a high amount of chloroplast, so they can really use the light they get. Seagrass also have roots that anchor them into the sediment, and they're there to hold them in place so they don't get swept off, and they also help to absorb nitrate and other important nutrients from the environment. Seagrass, they reproduce asexually, and they have underground stems, rhizomes, and they are buried in sediment, and they use this for asexual reproduction, so you can have new clones of the seagrass growing, and they also help to hold the seagrass in place. Seagrass also have flowers for sexual reproduction, and like all flying plants, seagrass produce pollen that is then transferred to other seagrass flowers. The pollen has a coat of protective mucus, so it can survive underwater, and is carried to the other flowers not by bees or wind, as we do on land, but by waves and water currents. The book and the syllabus then goes to kelp and uses those as an example. Kelp is just one example of many of the different types of seaweed, or as we call them, macroalgae. They're a different kind, the red, the brown, the green, and it's an entire wonderful world of stuff that looks like plants, but they're not. And the syllabus just touches on it, but there's a whole world there to learn about the different types of seaweed. They are from the protist kingdom, so they look like the plants, but that's because we have a parallel evolution. So what will work for a plant, having a large area for photosynthesis, will also work for the kelp or the seaweed. So we're just going to use kelp as an example here because that's what the book uses. Kelp has the large flat blades for photosynthesis, and they can do a lot of photosynthesis, and they can fixate a lot of carbon quite fast. They have gas bladders, so we can have them high up in the water column. And the blades and stripe always float on the surface, so you can get a lot of light there. What a stripe, that is what we would call a stem on a plant. And then we have the holdfast. Unlike plants who have roots, the seaweeds tend to have a holdfast, which is what glues them to a rock or another, something hard, which can hold them in the water at the location where they want to be. So if we go in and compare plants and macroalgae, we can see they kind of look the same, but the macroalgae, they don't have a stem, they have the stripe, and the macroalgae, they don't have the root, they have the holdfast. But beside that, they kind of have the same function. They make photosynthesis, they fixate carbon, they are key species in the different ecosystems. And in each ecosystem, either a kelp or a seagrass, they are cover for other animals, and they're a food source, and they are super important for keeping that environment stable. So that is why we like both our kelp forest and our seagrass meadows to be nice and safe, if possible. Then we move on to the wonderful world of microalgae. And again, here we just scratch the surface of this wild world of these tiny, tiny organisms who powers the world food chains and produce a lot of the world's oxygen. So they are super important. They're just small, and we don't see them a lot. And we're going to focus on dinoflagellates and diatoms in the syllabus. Dinoflagellates, they are microalgae, so they can grow very quickly. So if you have a few algae and there's enough nutrients, enough light, enough warmth, then suddenly they can have a very fast growth, and we can, in some cases, have what we call a algae bloom. Some of them can have bioluminescence, so they glow at night, and if you've never seen that, that looks awesome. Another important one are the zooxanthellae, which are a key species because they live inside the corals, and they help the corals perform photosynthesis in a symbiotic relationship, and we'll be talking more about that later. The other type of microalgae mentioned here are the diatoms. They're also a microalgae, and they're in the protist kingdom. Most of them are single cell, but some of them produce long ribbons. They're attached to each other. They do asexual reproduction. And there are many species of them, and most of them live in the plankton layer. Planktonic means you float around, and wind and ocean currents pushes you around. And they use photosynthesis for energy. And again, they can also make algae blooms if there are enough light and nutrients and heat. And they are an important part of the food chain because they're rapidly consumed by the primary consumers. And as a primary producer, which they are, and we'll go into that in chapter 4, they power most of the marine food chains, them and the other microalgae. They're all microscopic, so you need a microscope to see them. And if you see them in a microscope, they're actually wonderful and cool. They have chloroplast in their cell, and they have an external skeleton made from silica. And they can have these beautiful patterns you can see in the microscope. Both the seagrass and the kelp and our different microalgae are marine producers, which means they do photosynthesis, which we'll talk a lot more about in section 4.3. And they power most of the food chains in the ocean. There are, of course, also chemosynthesis in the black smokers, but that's a bit outside the syllabus, at least for this chapter. And they do so by fixating carbon. And fixating carbon means we get carbon into the food chains, and we take light energy and turn it into chemical energy. And without that, we wouldn't have any food chains, and we wouldn't have any oxygen. So they are hugely important for our entire marine environment and basically for all life on Earth. But especially the microalgae, they tend to be overlooked if you're not a marine scientist. Many people just see them as a green stuff floating around, but they are hugely important for our ecosystems. They are hugely important for oxygen production. They are important for fixating carbon. So they are really keystone species and need to be seen as that.